No Time to Die has finally arrived in theatres, and there's much to break down in Daniel Craig's final outing. Some of you may have already seen my review, and you'll know that I had a lot of problems with the film, with the plot being a central one of those issues. But regardless of my personal thoughts on the film, I'm going to be breaking down the plot, the ending, and events of No Time to Die, explaining what happened and where we could be going. This analysis will also contain spoilers, so if you do happen to be someone who hasn't seen the film yet, then I would recommend watching this video after you've seen it. But if you want to keep up to date on any of my future content, including a ranked list of Daniel Craig's Bond films, then don't forget to support this video by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. Also, feel free to check me out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Instagram at Cortex Videos, which is all linked in the description below. But without further ado, let's dive into the plot of No Time to Die Explained. So for the first time in James Bond's history, the main hero has died, leaving behind a child and his 00 number. But how does No Time to Die get to this moment? Well, as I explained in my review, the plot is really convoluted and definitely needs a clearer explanation to help with gathering the motivation behind events. No Time to Die starts with Rami Malek's Safin seeking revenge. Mr. White, a former high-ranking member of the villainous Spectre, who made major appearances in Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, and Spectre, killed Safin's parents and siblings, and as in retaliation, Safin kills White's wife, but saves his younger daughter, Madeleine Swann. This is of course motivated as described, but then the idea of releasing deadly nanobots on the global population is slightly muddled. Regardless, as I said yesterday, I really enjoy the opening 20 minutes of this film and the tone it sets. We learn that many years later, Madeleine Swann is trying to leave the past behind with James Bond, but of course, things soon catch up with them. Blofeld, operating from Belmarsh prison using a fake eye, has a Spectre agent attempt to assassinate Bond while he's visiting the grave of Eva Green's Vesper from Casino Royale. This is great, and it was awesome to see Vesper's character mentioned, becoming an emotional moment for Bond as he briefly reflects on the events of that first film. But Bond barely escapes this situation using cool set-up turrets that pop out from the headlights of his car, but blames Swann for the attack, and in turn, the two lovers part ways, with Bond leaving Swann on a train. This may all happen before Billie Eilish's theme song plays during the opening credits, but it's definitely key to understanding the rest of the movie. Swann, as we learn later though, was not responsible for giving away her and Bond's position. She was also pregnant with Bond's child at the time, as signalled by Swann as she reaches for her stomach when Bond puts her on the train. The assassination attempt was actually Blofeld's fault, but the iconic villain, who is played again by Christoph Waltz, has another nemesis who wants him dead. That's where Rami Malek's Safin comes back into play. He has been orchestrating the deaths of every Spectre member from his villainous island for many years, and having found a mole in a secret UK government lab, Safin uses a biological weapon that targets individuals using lethal nanobots. Spectre, with the nanobots in hand, influences Bond to their party in Cuba, which is actually another one of the sequences I liked in the film. Jeffrey Wright's Felix Leiter has come back into play with fellow henchman Logan Ash, and the two hope to employ Bond to work for the CIA and help recover the rogue scientist who is carrying the nanobots. After tracking down the scientist to a Spectre party in Cuba, they meet with Ana de Armas's Paloma, another CIA agent, who I must say was one of the standout parts that I wish we had more of. She's always drinking, funny, but also quite deadly in the action scene that follows. kind of like a reflection of the early days of Daniel Craig's Bond, but more upbeat rather than drinking away the pain, which Craig's character does an awful lot of in the older movies. But as the party turns deadly, the nanobots target the members of Spectre, and then Safin's men attempt to retrieve the scientist. Bond escapes with the scientist, and that's the last we see of Paloma, but we learn that Felix has also been double-crossed by his new right-hand man, Logan, who is working for Safin. He turns on Bond and Felix, shooting the American multiple times and then destroying the ship that they're on. Felix, of course, dies, and Bond goes out for vengeance, which he does later get once he kills Ash by letting a car fall on him. We in turn learn that Blofeld believes that the nanobots are sent to target Bond. However, the scientist in charge of the nanobots is secretly working for Safin and changes his target from Bond to the members of Spectre who were at the party. Of course, once it was unleashed, the virus kills everyone except for Bond and Paloma. So technically, Safin had just saved James Bond. And from here, there's only one Spectre member left, and that is Blofeld. Bond ends up taking Safin's targeted virus straight to the Spectre villain, while Safin later manages to persuade Swan to wear a sample of the nanobots while visiting him, which in turn, after a few complicated events, kills the character. However, Safin's not done and wants what every mustache-twirling villain wants, and that is world-conquering power, by continuing to develop the nanobots further. There are plenty of major deaths in No Time to Die, and perhaps one of the biggest is Bond's longtime nemesis Blofeld, who meets his demise during an interrogation scene. As Bond tries to find out what Blofeld knows about the nanobots, he is killed accidentally after Safin had forced Swan to apply the targeted nanobots to herself. She bails on the interrogation of Blofeld, however, just as she goes, Bond touches her wrist and therefore he becomes a carrier of the nanobots himself. When he strangles Blofeld, he passes on the killing mechanism and ends his life. It's not a bad thing, as this man has managed to orchestrate an entire villainous organisation using a fake eye from behind bars, but it was not Bond's intention. Also, with the writers trying to end the story of Spectre and move in the direction of Safin's villain halfway through, this is an understandable moment. But with Blofeld dead, it's slightly confusing to know what Safin's grand plan is after killing everyone who's a member of Spectre. At his island base, Safin's seemingly farming more of the nanobots, which are being wired to wipe out entire continents of people. It's a bioweapon of mass destruction, which Safin wants to wield, but the answer as to why appears to simply be for power. Safin's justifications, as described before, are frankly quite weak, and I honestly think it's one of the things that pulls this movie down from being as compelling as it could have been. The emotional stakes get wiped out with little motivation, and I personally would have liked a lot more surrounding why he was doing what he was. But having seen the devastating effects of the nanobots, Bond is pulled back into action and hunts Safin with the new 007, Nomi, played by Lashana Lynch. As made clear very quickly, Nomi has taken on the 007 badge following Bond's retirement, but however, when Bond comes back into action, she later asks for him to be reinstated as 007 for their last mission. As I said in my review, Lashana Lynch's new agent feels like a self-aware nod to the controversy around the casting of Bond, which I'm honestly fine with, but then she's not given much of a character to make her interesting on her own. At times, she also comes across as pretty annoying, repeating her role as 007 to James Bond before she gives it back to him, and it just feels completely obvious what they were trying to do with the character. I would have preferred Ana de Armas's Paloma as a sidekick to Bond in this movie, but hopefully we'll get more of her in the future. But coming back to the final act of No Time to Die, Nomi tracks down a rogue US agent who's working with Safin, while Bond goes after Swan. At Swan's childhood home, Bond finds her and discovers that she has a daughter named Mathilde. Swan insists that it's not his daughter, before them both being eventually captured by Safin. This leads to Bond locating his evil lair, which is a former World War II base, and with Nomi, the two 00 agents begin to infiltrate the base. Safin uses Swan and Mathilde to stop Bond from destroying the project, but Swan manages to escape, Nomi kills a few henchmen, and Bond ends up helping Swan, Nomi and Mathilde get to a small ship to sail away. Things aren't as straightforward as they seem though, as Q, operating from an airplane above, needs the blast doors to be open so that missiles can destroy the lab that Safin's built. Bond shoots his way to a control panel, opens the doors, and makes his way out, but tragedy is soon to follow. Because Safin closes the blast doors and swipes Bond with a version of the nanobots that targets Swan and Mathilde. Bond kills Safin, and not wanting to risk the fate of the world alongside Swan and Mathilde, heads back to open the blast doors, despite knowing that there's not enough time to reach the control room and evacuate the island. Bond opens the doors and gets patched through to Swan, where it is confirmed that Mathilde was his child and that Bond loves her. The missiles follow by raining down on the island, and James Bond dies in the process. We end the movie with Bond's family at MI5 toasting to the former 007, and Madeleine Swan drives into the sunset with Mathilde to the song We Have All the Time in the World by Louis Armstrong, which is the same theme from arguably the other most tragic Bond movie of them all, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. That is a film I love, and while I don't think it does as good as a job of conveying the emotion and stakes which that film does, it was a cool reference to end things off. Of course, we knew that this was going to be Daniel Craig's last James Bond movie, but we didn't know that the former 007 would be killed off in No Time to Die. His death is pretty final, as there are missiles falling all around him, and having Craig's character return in any form would take away from the emotional degree that this ending has. Danny Boyle, who was originally scheduled to direct Bond 25, was previously reported to have left the project over creative differences, some claiming that the disagreement came from Boyle not wanting Bond to die. There were discussions about killing off Bond in dramatic fashion at the end, claiming that Boyle called the idea ridiculous. Bond does die in spectacular fashion, and it's a huge moment, but it's one that will essentially cause controversy. I honestly didn't mind this, even though I know that a lot of people will not like the choice that they made. As I said in my review, there are other things in this movie that I find worse than the killing off of Bond, because at least that ending paid off in an emotional context. What I didn't like was the convoluted portrayal of the plot leading up to this moment, and the attempts at trying to get us to care for the relationship between Bond and Madeleine with a script that is so generalised. Again, I like the idea as it calls back to On Her Majesty's Secret Service and explores the emotional side of Bond, but the execution just felt very poor to me. Regardless, Bond will of course be back after this ending with a new actor and new stories to tell. So for the most part, that didn't bother me as much. But that was my video explaining the plot and ending for No Time to Die. I'm excited to see what direction they go in next, even though I didn't particularly like this latest film, and some of the ideas that they had on display were ones that honestly I think they could have done much better. But regardless, I'm interested to see who the next James Bond will be, and also what kind of approach and director that they are going to attach. Who would you like to see play James Bond next, and what type of film would you like to see? Let me know down below, alongside your thoughts on No Time to Die as a whole. But I do hope this did help some of you guys understand the events a bit better, and I will be doing more on James Bond over the next week. In particular, I will be posting a ranked list of Daniel Craig's James Bond movies, so keep a lookout for whenever I post. For more breakdown videos on big upcoming films during the end part of this year, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.